Hi, folks. We're going over our new bulletin at Providence Presbyterian Church in Gastonia, North Carolina, which, like I said last week, it's basically the what I got this from Wallingford Christ Presbyterian Church, and love the format. Our statement of vision for the church is a Christ-centered, gospel-driven, mission-focused church. On the inside cover, when you look at the inside cover, it gives you a description of what we're about, what's a Presbyterian church, and how we are a local church. Today, what I want to do is just talk about our witness, where we are located. And this is not just for us. This needs to be looked upon by any solid church that has accountability within the church structure and outside the church structure. And we'll talk about that next week. But this part here, welcome to the Presbyterian Church in Gastonia. This little caption here basically states this: our desire is that every human being would belong to a community shaped by the gospel of Jesus Christ and exists for the glory of God and the good of our neighbor. You could have a church, you could have a building, you could be in a community. But the authenticity of that church, the authenticity of its people, is it's being shaped by the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, his life, death, and resurrection. The second part says, we believe that a church is the best way to show the effects of the gospel in those who believe and to bring that life-changing message to the community. Now, within the church, you are to see specific a specific mold of what God conforms a church, a people that go to a church, what they look like. And what I want us to do is, here's what you're to see. And I'm going to go to the book of Philippians. Because as you'll notice, we're talking about gospel. And when people come into a church, here's what you should expect to see. Paul writes a letter to the Philippian church. It's one of the 2 or 3 churches where he actually has assurance that God saved them, that God's hand is in their life. He's really molding them. And I want you to see this because, listen, right now, in America alone, between 4,000 to 7,000 churches a year are closing down. And really, the basic reason for that is God shuts those doors of those churches that use his name but are no part of his being a disciple. And the key is being a follower of him. Listen to what Paul says in Philippians chapter 1. I'm going to begin in verse 3. He says, I want to thank my God in all my remembrance of you, making my prayer with joy, he says. Why? And then he says this, and this is the key, in verse 5. Because of your partnership in the gospel from the very beginning until now. So the first thing the reason why he's praying and there's joy is because of their partnership in the gospel. Now here's where the gospel brings a transformation that everyone could see. And I am sure of this, verse 6, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ. He said, it's right for me to feel this way about you. Why? Because you share in the confirmation and defense of this gospel. So in our opening part, you'll recognize people in the church who have been molded and shaped by the grace of God and by the gospel of the good news of Jesus Christ. And this is one of the effects the gospel has, not only in the building, but as a light in the community in which that group, that building is located. We continue, the gospel is the good news that through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we are free to live at peace with God and with each other. Folks, there's a lot of chaos going on our world. It's been like this. It goes through dormant times, but if you'll notice, it just takes one incident to ignite it. And the key to transform a society is not a churchianity, but a vibrant Christianity, a disciple whom God makes. And it only happens when the gospel is affirmed. And when you come to understand the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, his life being born under the law, and living in perfect obedience to the law, yet still suffering the consequence of death. But here's the reason. Jesus died not for himself, but for others. When we put our faith in his death, we in turn have our sins absolved. We have a new power put within us to overcome the tyranny of sin in our lives. That's the good news. That's the evidence when you walk into a church and when you see the marks of a community being transformed into his image. That's when you get rid of racism, division, and things along that line. It continues, we're free to live at peace with God and with each other. As we start to believe the gospel, it changes everything about us and the way we live within our community. Man, if there's anything that conforms us to Christ and the love of Christ, it's his gospel. It's going to also teach us how we parent, raise our children, and how we interact with the world at large. So the first key thing about welcoming you to the Providence Presbyterian Church is the guaranteed gospel transformation that comes when you believe it. Thank you for joining me. Next week we'll talk about what is a Presbyterian church. Thank you.